Right, so the United States spent months telling the world that Gaza needed an international stabilisation force. Israel nodded along as if the idea didn't make them sweat. And why would it when they've been given a veto over who can be part of it after all? And Western media dutifully reported this as if it were both reasonable and normal. But it's not. It's clearly being set up for Israel's advantage here. But a big fat spanner might have just been thrown into the works. Indonesia have just offered up to 20,000 trained peacekeepers ready to go now. Medics, engineers, construction teams, a whole lot. How can they possibly turn such an offer down? They fit the bill. This is what we want, right? Proper trained peacekeepers. Well, no. Israel really don't want that, do they? Can't imagine why, though, can you? Right, so Indonesia have stepped forward with the most serious peacekeeping offer for Gaza so far, and they did it without any theatrics, no posturing, without any of the other diplomatic hedging that Western governments like to hide behind whenever they say something about stability but mean something else entirely. Indonesia have trained 20,000 personnel. They're not combat brigades, they're health units and engineers, they're construction specialists, they're logistics teams. They're the sort of people you send if the priority is actually stitching hospitals back together and making roads passable and making shelters livable again, making the place fit for human beings again after a year or two of aerial bombardment, for example, of siege and systematic destruction. And Indonesia said it quite plainly. We prepared a maximum of 20,000 troops. We're waiting for further instructions on Gaza peace action. No drama, no military swagger, just readiness, just putting it out there. And because this is Indonesia we're talking about, the world's largest Muslim majority democracy as they are, a G20 state, a country with no diplomatic ties to Israel and therefore no stake in covering for what has unfolded in Gaza on their behalf, it lands slightly differently. It lands as a test. Because if the West and Israel meant a word they're saying about the need for international oversight and international stabilisation and international protection, then here it is, isn't it? 20,000 trained peacekeepers standing by, ready to go. Should be snapping their hands off. And the moment that offer went public, the entire frame around the so-called International Stabilisation Force, this peacekeeping force for Gaza, started to crack at the seams under its own contradictions. And this is where the mechanics matter, because the force Indonesia is talking about isn't the force the United States has been trying to shape behind closed doors. The US draft mandate, the one confirmed in various reports, isn't a peacekeeping mandate in the UN sense. It carries the language of all necessary measures. And if you've watched international law long enough, you know that phrase isn't often used for humanitarian work. It's used for enforcement. It's used when the mission isn't about protecting civilians, but controlling territory and demilitarizing a population and policing movement. The draft the US floated was designed around border control, weapons seizures, and enforcement authority. And the only way that structure works is if the people enforcing it are politically aligned with Israel and unwilling to challenge its actions in Gaza, which is why Israel have demanded and have effectively received the informal right to approve or reject which states can contribute troops. It's not written on a big banner. You won't find it spelled out in a Security Council document, but you will find it in the quiet reporting. Israel must approve any state that sends troops, which means the occupying power, the state accused of genocide and war crimes by UN experts and more, become the one choosing who monitors its own behaviour. So the absurdity just speaks for itself. So this announcement from Indonesia of 20,000 peacekeepers ready to go. And the West doesn't celebrate it, does it? Israel doesn't welcome it. The United States doesn't rush to incorporate it and snap their hands off for such a generous offer, if this were genuinely about peacekeeping, of course. Instead, you get silence in the Western press and equivocation in diplomatic statements and the immediate return of the same circular language we've heard for months. Further discussions are needed. The mandate's unclear. Operational details still have to be worked out. And here's the point. Those issues weren't unclear when the United States was selling the idea of an international force. They only became unclear when a non-aligned power capable of operating independently of Israel's political interests volunteered to take part. So Indonesia becomes the stress test for the whole project. If the mission is about protection, Indonesia fits the bill perfectly. If the mission is about reconstruction, Indonesia fits. If the mission is about humanitarian stabilisation, Indonesia fits. But if the mission is about political control, Indonesia does not fit. And the reaction you're seeing across the Western class and Israeli political class as well tells you exactly which objective is actually in play. Now let's take another example. The UAE comes into this and blows another hole clean through the same narrative, but from a very different angle. The UAE is one of the few Arab states that has openly normalised relations with Israel, of course. It's the flagship case the West points to whenever it wants to argue that the region is moving past conflict and past ideology into some sort of pragmatic order that requires Israel to be at the centre of it all. The Abraham Accords were sold as proof of that, and yet when the UAE was asked to join the Gaza stabilisation force, it refused. Not refused because it opposes peace, though given their machinations in the genocide of Sudan and their arming of the RSF, big caveat on that, they haven't refused it because it opposes reconstruction either. It has refused it because the mandate of it is unclear. The legal framework for this is completely absent, and the mission looks like it would require UAE troops to potentially confront Hamas or other Palestinian armed groups on Israel's behalf. The UAE said it straight, it will not join without clarity, and that clarity doesn't exist because the mission isn't designed to be neutral. It's designed to be useful to Israel's security agenda. And if even the UAE, a state that has staked significant political capital on normalisation, won't touch the mission as constructed as a result of that, then the problem isn't the UAE's caution, the problem's the mission itself. And the moment you add that to Indonesia's offer, the entire picture sharpens, doesn't it? Because what you're seeing isn't a queue of willing states dragging their feet. You're seeing the difference between a real peacekeeping opportunity and a political project built to look like peacekeeping while functioning like occupation. So you look at who the US engaged in discussions as well then, don't you? Azerbaijan, Egypt, Qatar. These are states with leverage points the US can pull. Egypt controls Rafah. Qatar mediates hostage deals and balances regional alliances. Azerbaijan is an Israeli ally in security matters and the supplier of 40% of their oil. These are comfortable choices for Israel. They are predictable. They won't challenge the political arrangement. They won't file reports that make Western governments uncomfortable. They won't insist on a mandate that constrains Israel's freedom to operate inside Gaza. Indonesia, by contrast, would absolutely insist on exactly that. It wants a UN Security Council resolution. It wants legal clarity. It wants humanitarian roles, not combat duties. And because Indonesia has no diplomatic ties with Israel, it won't be leaned on behind closed doors. And so the force starts to look less like a neutral stabilisation mission and more like a mechanism for selective inclusion. Compliant states in, independent states out. And the inclusion criteria have nothing to do with capability. They've got everything to do with political alignment with the occupier, and the occupier get no say at all in any of it. So once you see the structure, the rest of the behaviour starts to make sense, doesn't it? The Western press has barely touched Indonesia's offer. What a surprise, despite it being one of the most significant troop readiness announcements yet made in relation to this supposed plan. Indonesia has broader diplomatic ambitions and its positioning in the Gaza peace process. But the Western media ecosystem hasn't treated the offer as front-page news, and that's because reporting it prominently would force uncomfortable questions, wouldn't it? Questions like, if the world's largest Muslim-majority nation wants to send humanitarian peacekeepers, why won't the West accept them? If 20,000 medics and engineers are ready to deploy, why aren't the same governments who demanded responsible partners celebrating the biggest responsible partner they've yet been offered? Once you ask those questions, and the entire stabilisation narrative Israel and the US have been pushing of late completely collapses. Because the West doesn't have a credibility problem, it has a control problem. It wants an international force that's international on paper, but politically neutered in practice. Indonesia destroys that equilibrium because it forces the function of the force to reveal itself. And clearly that means it's not humanitarian and it's not about peacekeeping. So you keep walking through the mechanics. Indonesia's offer is contingent on a UN Security Council mandate. That's the threshold for real peacekeeping. If a state wants legitimacy and accountability and neutrality, that's where it goes. But a UN mandate means the mission is run by the UN, not by Israel or the US. It means troop contributions come from the states willing to join under UN conditions. It means Israel loses that informal veto. It means the mission's mandate is built around actual civilian protection and not border enforcement. It means reporting requirements become formal. And once you put Indonesia even in the qualifying pool for such a mission, the power balance shifts, because Malaysia follows Indonesia's lead. Turkey's already said they wanted to be a part of this. Israel have already said no to them. Pakistan could too. South Africa could provide civilian oversight or legal support. The global south becomes a real actor in Gaza's future, and that's precisely what Israel does not want. Israel wants a Gaza's future defined by its security apparatus, its political conditions, and its strategic requirements. It doesn't want peacekeepers documenting its operations. It doesn't want independent militaries watching the border. It doesn't want medical brigades reporting the humanitarian consequences of their military decisions. It doesn't want a force that returns Gaza to Palestinian administrative hands. It wants a structure where Palestinian governance is heavily conditioned, where they are really in control, and where international presence functions as a buffer for Israeli policy rather than a check on it. That's why the UAE's refusal is that second stress test. If the UAE had joined, Israel could have pointed to Arab involvement and claimed regional legitimacy. It could have said the force is not imposed, it's endorsed. But the UAE said no, because the mission would require direct confrontation with Hamas without a clear legal basis. And the UAE knows what that looks like. It looks like being drawn into a conflict without political cover, without operational control, without clarity on exit strategy, and with the full weight of Palestinian anger landing not on Israel, but on the Arab state physically present in Gaza. The UAE was being positioned as the Arab face of an Israeli-friendly enforcement mission, and because the UAE doesn't want to take on that role, it becomes the canary. If the UAE won't do it, who will in which case? And what does that say about the mission's design, therefore? So by the time you lay the facts in order, the picture actually isn't that complicated at all. It's simple. Indonesia has 20,000 peacekeepers ready to go. That's fact. Indonesia wants a UN mandate. Fact. Indonesia's role would be humanitarian. Fact. Indonesia is trusted by Palestinians. Fact. Israel doesn't want Indonesia involved for all of those reasons, grounded in the fact that Israel has no diplomatic ties with Indonesia, and the mission requires Israeli approval under the current US-led structure. The UAE refuses the mission without legal clarity. Fact. The US wants a mandate that includes enforcement powers. Fact. Western media is avoiding the story completely. And so you're left with a structure that says international stabilisation, but functions like selective internationalisation. And the moment a real stabilisation partner arrives, one that would change the mission into something actually resembling peacekeeping, the entire project stalls. So you come back to the simplest reading, don't you? If the mission were about peacekeeping, Indonesia's offer would be a front-page celebration. If the mission were about reconstruction, the US draft would prioritise humanitarian logistics instead of enforcement clauses. If the mission were about protecting civilians, Israel wouldn't need to approve the peacekeepers sent to protect those civilians. And if the mission were about international legitimacy, the UAE wouldn't be running away from it. The only way to make sense of the structure is to take it at face value. The mission isn't built to restrain Israel, it's built to restrain Palestinian political and military capacity in a way that preserves Israeli freedom to operate as they continue to do so, genocidally. And Indonesia's arrival throws into that spotlight because Indonesia represents exactly the kind of actor Israel doesn't want in Gaza. Independent, neutral, and capable of saying what it sees. So where does that leave us then? It leaves it here. Indonesia has offered the single biggest test of Western and Israeli sincerity the Gaza war has generated. Because if 20,000 humanitarian peacekeepers aren't welcome, then peacekeeping isn't the objective. If a real UN mandate is unacceptable, then legality isn't the objective. If independent states are excluded, then neutrality isn't the objective. And if the occupying power gets to decide the composition of the force sent to restrain it, then accountability certainly isn't the objective. The objective is control, and Indonesia has just shown the world exactly how that control is maintained, by offering everything the plan ostensibly needs, and inevitably getting turned down because of just that. This isn't the only story in recent weeks, of course, where Indonesia has been shown to have principles and standing up to power either where it comes to Israel. The International Olympic Committee now demanding sporting organisations blacklist the nation for refusing to issue visas to Israeli gymnasts, refusing to entertain the notion that Israel should be permitted to carry on as normal as they continue to perpetrate genocide even during a supposed ceasefire. So you get all the details of that story here. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next one. Cheers, folks.